In the shadowed halls of Buckingham Palace, where ancient traditions clash with modern tensions, one man's unwavering loyalty would be tested like never before. Captain James Morrison had sworn an oath to protect the royal family with his life, but he never imagined that oath would put him between a future king and the son of a queen consort whose ambitions knew no bounds. What happens when duty collides with family politics? When protecting one royal means confronting another? This is the true story of a royal guard who discovered that sometimes the greatest threats to the crown come from within its own walls. The morning of March 15th started like any other at the palace, but by nightfall, everything would change, and Captain Morrison would make a decision that would echo through the corridors of power and reshape the very future of the British monarchy. Some secrets are worth dying for. Some loyalties run deeper than blood, and sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you least expect. Captain James Morrison adjusted his uniform one final time as he prepared for the morning briefing. 23 years of service to the Royal Protection Squad had taught him that every detail mattered, especially on days when the palace buzzed with unusual activity. Today was one of those days. The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of the security office as Morrison reviewed the daily schedules. Prince William had returned from his Commonwealth tour just 2 days ago, and his presence at the palace always meant heightened security protocols. But it wasn't just the prince's return that had Morrison on edge. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son from her first marriage, had been making increasingly frequent visits to the palace over the past month. Each visit seemed to coincide with important royal business, and Morrison's trained instincts told him something wasn't right. The man carried himself with an arrogance that made Morrison's teeth clench, treating palace staff like servants and acting as though he had some inherent right to be there. Morrison had noticed things others might have missed: the way Tom lingered outside closed meeting rooms, the questions he asked staff members about the prince's schedule, and most concerning of all, the subtle attempts to gain access to areas of the palace that were strictly off-limits to non-working royals. As head of the prince's personal security detail, Morrison made it his business to know everything that could potentially threaten his charge. The briefing room filled with the usual morning crowd of security personnel, but Morrison could feel the tension in the air. Inspector Sarah Wells, his second in command, caught his eye as she entered with a folder marked "Urgent, Eyes Only." "Sir, we need to discuss the Tom Parker Bowles situation," she said quietly, taking a seat beside him. Morrison nodded grimly. He had hoped his suspicions were unfounded, but Wells was one of the sharpest minds in the protection squad. If she was concerned, there was definitely cause for alarm. "What have you found?" Morrison asked, keeping his voice low as other officers settled into their seats. Wells opened the folder slightly, revealing photographs and documents. "He's been asking questions about the prince's private study, specifically about when it's unoccupied. Yesterday, housekeeping reported finding him on the second floor, claiming he was looking for a bathroom, but the second floor has 3 clearly marked guest facilities." Morrison's jaw tightened. The prince's private study contains sensitive documents related to his future role as king, including confidential briefings about government policies and diplomatic matters. Access to that room was restricted to the prince himself and 2 trusted staff members. "There's more," Wells continued. "The IT department flagged unusual activity on one of the guest computers in the blue drawing room. Someone attempted to access the palace's internal network using what appeared to be sophisticated hacking software. The attempt was made during Tom's visit last Tuesday. The pieces were falling into place in Morrison's mind, forming a picture he didn't like. Tom Parker Bowles wasn't just being nosy or overstepping boundaries. He was actively trying to gather intelligence on the prince, possibly for reasons that could damage the monarchy itself. "Has the prince been informed?" Morrison asked. Wells shook her head. "Not yet. We wanted to bring this to you first, given your position as his primary protection officer." Morrison appreciated the chain of command being followed, but this situation was delicate. Tom was technically family, even if only through marriage. Accusations against him would need to be handled carefully, with absolute proof and proper protocols followed. The morning briefing began with routine matters, but Morrison found himself distracted. His mind kept returning to the implications of what Wells had discovered. If Tom was indeed gathering sensitive information about the prince, the question was why. Was it simple curiosity, misguided family pride, or something more sinister? After the briefing, Morrison made his way to the prince's private quarters. Prince William was reviewing correspondence at his desk, still showing signs of jet lag from his recent travels. Morrison knocked and was immediately granted entry. "Good morning, Your Highness. I hope you're settling back in well after your tour." The prince looked up with a tired but genuine smile. "James, good to see you. Yes, it's good to be home, though I'm still catching up on everything that happened while I was away." Morrison hesitated for a moment, then decided on a direct approach. "Sir, there are some security concerns we need to discuss regarding recent activities in the palace." The prince's expression became more alert. "What kind of concerns?" "There have been some irregularities involving Tom Parker Bowles during his recent visits. We've documented attempts to access restricted areas and possible unauthorized computer usage." Prince William set down his papers and leaned back in his chair. Morrison could see the wheels turning in his mind as he processed this information. The prince was no stranger to palace politics and understood the delicate balance required when dealing with family members who weren't direct heirs to the throne. "What evidence do we have?" the prince asked, his tone serious but measured. Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed the prince the security footage Wells had compiled. The videos clearly showed Tom in areas he shouldn't have been at times when he had no legitimate reason to be there. The prince watched silently, his expression growing more concerned with each clip. "This is troubling," the prince admitted. "Tom has always been ambitious, but I never thought he would cross these kinds of lines." Morrison nodded. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to implement additional monitoring protocols. We need to understand the full scope of what he's trying to accomplish and protect against any potential security breaches." "Do what you need to do, James. The integrity of the palace and the security of our operations cannot be compromised, regardless of family connections." As Morrison prepared to leave, the prince added, "Keep this between us for now. If we're going to address this situation, we need to be absolutely certain of our facts and prepared for the consequences." Morrison spent the rest of the morning coordinating with his team to establish discreet surveillance measures. They would monitor Tom's movements whenever he was in the palace, track his computer usage, and document any attempts to access restricted information. It was delicate work, requiring the team to be invisible while gathering evidence. The palace operated like a small city, with dozens of staff members going about their daily routines. Morrison had always prided himself on knowing every face, every routine, every potential vulnerability. Now he was adding a new element to that equation, monitoring a family member who might be working against the very institution he was supposed to respect and protect. By afternoon, Morrison received word that Tom had scheduled another visit for the following day. This would be the team's first opportunity to put their enhanced surveillance measures into practice. Morrison briefed his officers carefully, emphasizing the need for discretion and thorough documentation. As the day wound down, Morrison found himself reflecting on the weight of his responsibilities. Protecting the royal family wasn't just about physical security. It involved safeguarding the very foundations of the monarchy itself. The institution depended on trust, discretion, and the unwavering loyalty of those who served it. Standing at his office window, looking out over the palace grounds where he had served faithfully for more than 2 decades, Morrison felt the familiar sense of purpose that had driven him throughout his career. Whatever Tom Parker Bowles was planning, Morrison would be ready. The prince's safety and the security of the crown were not negotiable, no matter who posed the threat. The setting sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, and Morrison knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But he also knew that he and his team were prepared to face whatever came their way. The oath he had taken all those years ago was more than just words. It was a sacred trust that he would honor regardless of the personal cost. As he prepared to brief the night shift and head home to his small flat near the palace, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that the real test of his loyalty and professional skills was just beginning. Tom Parker Bowles had shown his hand, and now it was time for Morrison to show his. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp London air that usually cleared Morrison's head and sharpened his focus. Today, however, he felt the weight of anticipation as he prepared for Tom Parker Bowles' scheduled visit. The enhanced surveillance protocols were in place, and his team was positioned throughout the palace like pieces on a chessboard. Morrison positioned himself in the central security hub, where multiple screens displayed feeds from cameras throughout the building. Inspector Wells coordinated field operations, while Officer David Chen monitored the computer networks for any suspicious activity. The operation had to be flawless while remaining completely invisible to their target. Tom arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, dressed in an expensive suit that somehow managed to look both formal and casual. Morrison watched through the cameras as palace staff greeted him with the polite deference reserved for family members of the royals. But Morrison noticed something the others missed: the small leather portfolio Tom carried, and the way his eyes immediately began scanning the entrance hall as if memorizing details. "Target is in the building," Morrison spoke quietly into his headset. "All units maintain standard positions and document everything." Tom's first stop was the blue drawing room, where Camilla was hosting a small charity meeting. Morrison watched as Tom kissed his mother on both cheeks and exchanged pleasantries with the other attendees. To any observer, he appeared to be a dutiful son paying his respects. But Morrison noticed how Tom's attention kept drifting to the ornate desk near the window, the same desk that housed one of the computers flagged by the IT department. After 30 minutes of polite conversation, Tom excused himself, claiming he needed to make some phone calls. Morrison's pulse quickened as he watched Tom leave the drawing room and immediately turned toward the restricted corridor that led to the prince's private study. "Wells, he's moving toward the second-floor east wing," Morrison transmitted. "Copy that, sir. I'm in position near the portrait gallery." Morrison switched camera angles to follow Tom's progress. The man moved with purpose. No longer the casual family visitor, but someone with a specific objective. He paused at the entrance to the prince's private corridor, looking both ways before producing what appeared to be a small electronic device from his jacket pocket. "Chen, are you seeing this?" Morrison asked. "Yes, sir, that looks like some kind of signal detector or scanning device." Morrison's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Tom wasn't just snooping. He was using sophisticated equipment to gather intelligence. This was no longer about family curiosity or overstepping boundaries. This was espionage. Tom spent several minutes near the entrance to the prince's study, holding the device at different angles and occasionally making notes in a small pad. Morrison documented every movement, every action, building an ironclad case that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. "Sir," Chen's voice crackled through the headset, "I'm showing attempted network intrusion from the blue drawing room computer." Same signature as the previous attempts. Morrison's jaw clenched. While Tom was physically gathering intelligence upstairs, someone else was using his access to the drawing room to hack the palace's computer systems. This was a coordinated operation, not the work of one ambitious family member acting alone. "Wells, maintain visual on target. Chen, can you trace the computer activity?" "Working on it, sir. Whoever is doing this knows what they're doing. They're using advanced encryption and routing techniques." Morrison made a quick decision. "I'm going to the blue drawing room to identify the computer user." He left the security hub and moved quickly through the palace corridors, his years of experience allowing him to navigate the building's maze-like layout without being seen by Tom or alerting other staff to any emergency. As he approached the blue drawing room, he could hear the gentle murmur of conversation from Camilla's charity meeting. Morrison positioned himself where he could observe the room without being seen. The meeting was still in progress, with 6 women seated around a small conference table discussing fundraising strategies. But near the window, partially hidden behind a decorative screen, a 7th person sat at the computer terminal. Morrison recognized her immediately. Patricia Hartwell, a woman in her 40s who had recently been hired as Camilla's personal assistant. She wore an expression of intense concentration as her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, occasionally glancing toward the meeting to ensure she wasn't being observed. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with shocking clarity. Tom and Patricia were working together, using Tom's family connections to gain access to the palace, while Patricia used her position as Camilla's assistant to access sensitive systems. Morrison felt a cold anger building in his chest as he realized the scope of their betrayal. His headset crackled softly. "Sir, target is moving back toward the first floor." Morrison quickly retreated to a position where he could observe Tom's return to the drawing room. The timing was perfect. Tom rejoined the charity meeting just as Patricia finished whatever she was doing at the computer and returned to her seat at the conference table. "Chen, what's the status on the network intrusion?" "Activity ceased approximately 30 seconds ago, sir. They were trying to access files related to the prince's upcoming diplomatic meetings. Morrison's blood ran cold. The prince was scheduled to meet with several world leaders over the coming weeks, discussions that would shape international policy and trade agreements. The information they were trying to steal wasn't just embarrassing personal details, it was intelligence that could compromise national security. He immediately contacted Prince William's private secretary and requested an urgent meeting. Within 20 minutes, Morrison found himself in the prince's study, laying out the evidence of Tom and Patricia's operation. "This is far worse than we initially suspected, Your Highness," Morrison explained, showing the prince photographs and computer logs. "They're not just gathering gossip or trying to gain social advantage. They're systematically stealing classified information." Prince William studied the evidence with growing disbelief and anger. "My God, James. The diplomatic briefings thereafter, some of that information could damage relationships with our closest allies." "Yes, sir. And given the sophistication of their operation, I don't believe they're working alone. This has the hallmarks of a larger intelligence-gathering network." The prince stood and paced to the window, looking out over the palace grounds where tourists gathered at the gates, unaware of the drama unfolding inside. "What do you recommend?" Morrison had been preparing for this question. "Sir, I believe we need to allow them to continue their operation under controlled circumstances, while we gather more evidence and identify their full network. If we move too quickly, we might miss other conspirators. You want to use them as bait." "In essence, yes. We feed them false information while documenting their methods and contacts. It's the only way to ensure we've identified everyone involved." Prince William turned back to Morrison, his expression resolute. "Do it. But James, I want absolute control over what information they can access. Nothing that could genuinely damage the crown or our international relationships." "Understood, sir. I'll coordinate with MI5 to ensure proper oversight of the operation." As Morrison prepared to leave, the prince added, "And James, thank you for your vigilance." If you hadn't been watching, Morrison nodded grimly. "It's my job, sir, and I take that job very seriously." The rest of the afternoon was spent coordinating with intelligence services and setting up the controlled information leak operation. Morrison felt the familiar satisfaction of a complex problem being systematically solved, but underneath that satisfaction was a deep sadness at the betrayal they had uncovered. Tom Parker Bowles had violated the trust of the family that had welcomed him, using his position to endanger the very institution that had given him status and privilege. Patricia Hartwell had exploited her employer's confidence to steal state secrets. Both had chosen personal gain over loyalty and duty. As the day ended and Tom and Patricia left the palace, apparently satisfied with their activities, Morrison watched them go with the knowledge that their freedom was temporary. The net was closing around them, and soon they would face the consequences of their choices. But Morrison also knew that the hardest part was yet to come. When the operation concluded and arrests were made, the scandal would rock the royal family and provide ammunition for Republicans and critics of the monarchy. The very information Tom and Patricia sought to steal would pale in comparison to the damage their exposure would cause. Standing in his office as darkness fell over London, Morrison reflected on the complex nature of his duty. Protecting the royal family wasn't just about stopping physical threats. It involved navigating political minefields, family betrayals, and the constant challenge of serving an institution that was both deeply traditional and constantly evolving. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the controlled operation began in earnest. Morrison would need to balance the need for evidence with the risk of allowing genuine damage to occur. It would require all of his experience and judgment to ensure that justice was served while protecting the crown from lasting harm. The game was about to begin in earnest, and Morrison was determined that when it ended, the monarchy would emerge stronger and more secure than before. The controlled operation had been running for 10 days when everything changed. Morrison arrived at the palace on a gray Thursday morning to find a message waiting that made his blood run cold. MI5 had intercepted communications indicating that Tom and Patricia planned to sell their stolen information to foreign agents within the next 48 hours. "Sir, we need to move now," Inspector Wells reported as Morrison reviewed the overnight intelligence briefings. "They're no longer just gathering information for future use. They're actively planning to transfer classified material to hostile foreign powers." Morrison felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with critical decisions. The careful, methodical approach they had been taking was no longer viable. Every hour they delayed increased the risk that genuine state secrets would fall into enemy hands. "Have we identified their contacts?" Morrison asked, scanning the intelligence reports. "Partially, sir. The communications mention a meeting at the Dorchester Hotel tomorrow evening. MI5 has surveillance in place, but they're concerned about the short timeline." Morrison made his decision quickly. "We end this today. Coordinate with MI5 to have arrest teams ready and prepare full documentation of our evidence. I want this handled so thoroughly that there's no possibility of legal challenges." The next few hours passed in a blur of coordination and preparation. Morrison briefed Prince William on the accelerated timeline, receiving authorization to take whatever steps were necessary to protect national security. The prince's face was grim as he absorbed the full scope of the betrayal. "To think that Tom would actually sell information to foreign powers," the prince said quietly. "I knew he was ambitious and sometimes unethical, but treason—" Morrison nodded gravely. "Sir, some people are willing to cross any line for money or power. Our job is to ensure they face consequences for those choices." Tom arrived at the palace promptly at 2 o'clock for what he believed would be another routine visit. Morrison watched from the security hub as Tom went through his usual routine, greeting staff members, kissing his mother, and making small talk about family matters. The normalcy of the scene was almost surreal given what Morrison knew was about to unfold. But today, there was something different in Tom's demeanor. He seemed nervous, checking his phone frequently and glancing around as if sensing that something had changed. Morrison wondered if Tom had been alerted somehow, or if he was simply feeling the natural tension that came with planning to commit treason. Patricia Hartwell was already at work at the computer terminal in the blue drawing room, apparently attempting to access the latest batch of diplomatic files. Morrison watched her with disgust as she violated her employer's trust one final time, unaware that every keystroke was being monitored and recorded. "Chen, are we ready to shut down their computer access?" Morrison asked. "Yes, sir. All their activities are being redirected to a secure server with false information. They think they're accessing genuine files, but everything they're downloading is fabricated." Morrison smiled grimly. Even in their final moments of freedom, Tom and Patricia would be frustrated in their goals. The false information they were stealing would be useless to their foreign contacts, providing no value while serving as additional evidence of their treasonous intent. At 3:30, Morrison received the signal he had been waiting for. MI5 teams were in position throughout the palace and the surrounding area. It was time to spring the trap that had been weeks in the making. Morrison left the security hub and made his way to the blue drawing room, where Camilla's charity meeting was winding down. He positioned himself outside the door, knowing that Tom would have to pass him on his way out. Inspector Wells took position near the main entrance while other security personnel covered alternate exits. The charity meeting ended at 4 o'clock and the attendees began filing out of the drawing room. Morrison watched as Tom lingered behind, clearly waiting for an opportunity to coordinate with Patricia. It was exactly the behavior Morrison had expected, confirming that the two conspirators were following their established pattern. Finally, Tom emerged from the drawing room, the leather portfolio clutched tightly in his hand. As he walked down the corridor, Morrison stepped into his path, flanked by 2 other security officers. "Parker Bowles, I need you to come with me immediately." Tom's face went pale, but he attempted to maintain his composure. "I'm sorry, Captain Morrison, but I'm actually in quite a hurry. Perhaps we could speak later?"
"I'm afraid not, sir."
"This is a matter of national security, and it cannot wait." Tom's eyes darted left and right looking for escape routes, but Morrison's team had positioned themselves to block any attempt to flee. The man who had strutted through the palace for weeks, acting as though he belonged there, now looked like a trapped animal. "I don't understand what this is about," Tom said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm family. I have every right to be here." Morrison's voice was steady and professional, but his eyes were cold as steel. "Parker Bowles, you are under arrest on suspicion of theft of state secrets, computer fraud, and conspiracy to commit treason. You have the right to remain silent." As Morrison read Tom his rights, he could see the man's carefully constructed facade crumbling. The arrogance and entitlement that had characterized Tom's behavior throughout his visits to the palace evaporated, replaced by panic and desperate calculation. "This is ridiculous," Tom protested as Morrison's officers began to search him. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just visiting my mother." Morrison said nothing as his team removed electronic devices, documents, and memory storage devices from Tom's pockets and portfolio. Each item would be cataloged and analyzed, adding to the mountain of evidence that would ensure Tom's conviction. At the same time, Wells was coordinating Patricia Hartwell's arrest in another part of the palace. The woman who had used her position as Camilla's assistant to steal state secrets was taken into custody while still seated at the computer terminal, her illegal downloads only half completed. Morrison personally escorted Tom to a secure interview room in the palace's security wing, a space that few people knew existed. The room was designed for questioning individuals who posed potential threats to the royal family, equipped with recording equipment and secure communications. As they walked through the corridors, Tom made one final attempt to assert his position. "You're making a terrible mistake, Morrison. When my mother hears about this, your career will be over." Morrison stopped walking and turned to face Tom directly. The months of watching this man abuse his family connections, endanger national security, and threaten the institution Morrison had devoted his life to protecting had built up a cold anger that now found its voice. "Mr. Parker Bowles, your mother will indeed hear about this. She'll hear about how her son betrayed the family that welcomed him, stole state secrets, and planned to sell them to foreign enemies. She'll hear about how you used her trust and position to commit treason against the crown." Tom's face went ashen as the full implications of his situation became clear. The family connections he had been counting on to protect him would instead become sources of shame and scandal. Camilla would have to live with the knowledge that her son had used her position to attack the very institution she had married into. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," Morrison continued. "We have video surveillance, computer forensics, intercepted communications, and physical evidence. Your only choice now is whether to cooperate with the investigation or face the full consequences of your actions alone." As they reached the interview room, Tom seemed to collapse in on himself. The confident, arrogant man who had walked through the palace as though he owned it was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his crimes. Morrison handed Tom over to the MI5 interrogation team, knowing that his own role in the investigation was largely complete. He had identified the threat, gathered the evidence, and neutralized the danger to the royal family and national security. The legal proceedings that would follow were outside his purview, but as Morrison made his way back to the security hub to coordinate the aftermath of the arrests, he felt no satisfaction in the successful conclusion of the operation. The betrayal they had uncovered would cause lasting damage to the royal family, providing ammunition for critics and sowing seeds of doubt about the security of the monarchy itself. He also thought about Camilla, who would soon learn that her son had used her love and trust to commit crimes against her new family. The woman who had worked so hard to find acceptance within the royal family would now have to deal with the scandal and shame of her son's treachery. As Morrison began preparing his final report on the investigation, he reflected on the complex nature of loyalty and betrayal. Tom Parker Bowles had been given every advantage, welcomed into one of the world's most exclusive families, and granted access to privileges that most people could never imagine. But instead of honoring those gifts, he had chosen to exploit them for personal gain. The arrests of Tom Parker Bowles and Patricia Hartwell would send a clear message that betraying the crown carried severe consequences, regardless of family connections or social position. But Morrison knew that the real work of protecting the monarchy was never finished. There would always be new threats, new challenges, and new tests of loyalty. Standing at his office window as evening fell over London, Morrison watched the palace guards changing shift with their traditional precision and ceremony. The continuity of tradition, the unbroken chain of service and duty that stretched back centuries, had been preserved once again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today, the crown was secure. 3 months had passed since the arrests of Tom Parker Bowles and Patricia Hartwell, and the reverberations of their betrayal continued to ripple through the royal family and the British establishment. Morrison stood in his office, reviewing the final classified reports from MI5 that detailed the full scope of the espionage network they had uncovered. The investigation had revealed connections to foreign intelligence services that reached far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Tom and Patricia had been part of a sophisticated operation designed to penetrate the highest levels of British society and government. Their arrests had led to the exposure of 6 other individuals working in various government departments, all feeding information to hostile foreign powers. Morrison felt a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion as he closed the final report. The operation had been a complete success from a security standpoint, but the personal cost had been enormous for everyone involved. Camilla had been devastated by her son's betrayal, requiring weeks of private counseling to deal with the shame and confusion of learning that someone she loved had used her trust to commit treason. Prince William had handled the crisis with the dignity and strength that Morrison had come to expect from him, but the strain was visible. The prince had been forced to testify in closed court proceedings, reliving the details of how his own stepbrother had attempted to steal state secrets from his private study. The violation of trust had shaken the prince's faith in family relationships and made him more guarded in his interactions with extended family members. A soft knock on his office door interrupted Morrison's reflections. Inspector Wells entered carrying a folder marked with the royal seal, indicating an official communication from the palace's senior management. "Sir, this just arrived from the prince's private secretary," Wells said, handing him the folder. Morrison opened it to find a formal letter bearing Prince William's personal signature. As he read the contents, his eyebrows rose in surprise. The letter was an official commendation for exceptional service to the crown, accompanied by notification that Morrison was being recommended for a knighthood, in recognition of his role in protecting national security. "The prince wants to see you at your earliest convenience," Wells added, noting Morrison's expression. "I believe he wants to discuss this personally." Morrison made his way through the familiar corridors of the palace, past portraits of monarchs and paintings depicting centuries of royal history. As he walked, he reflected on how his own small part in that history had been to protect the institution from threats that came not from foreign armies or political revolutionaries, but from within the royal family itself. He found Prince William in his private study, the same room that Tom Parker Bowles had tried so desperately to infiltrate. The prince was seated at his desk but rose as Morrison entered, extending his hand in greeting. "James, thank you for coming. Please, sit down." Morrison took the offered chair, noting that the prince looked more relaxed than he had in months. The strain of dealing with the scandal had been replaced by a quiet confidence that suggested the crisis had been fully resolved. "I wanted to speak with you personally about the commendation," the prince began. "What you did over those weeks, the way you identified the threat and handled such a delicate situation, probably prevented a diplomatic disaster that could have damaged our relationships with several allied nations." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, I was simply doing my job. Any member of the protection squad would have taken the same actions." "No, James, they wouldn't have," the prince said firmly. "It would have been easy to dismiss Tom's behavior as simple family politics or over-enthusiastic curiosity. Most people would have given him the benefit of the doubt because of his family connections. You saw through that and followed your instincts even when it meant investigating someone who was technically part of the royal family." The prince stood and walked to the window, looking out over the palace grounds. "Do you know what the hardest part of this whole situation was for me?" Morrison remained silent, sensing that the prince needed to work through his thoughts. "It wasn't the security breach or even the threat to state secrets," the prince continued. "It was realizing that someone I had welcomed into family gatherings, someone I had trusted around my children, had been systematically betraying that trust. It made me question my judgment about people, about family relationships, about everything." Morrison understood the prince's struggle. The royal family operated on a delicate balance of trust and protocol, where personal relationships were intertwined with matters of state. Tom's betrayal had violated both the personal and political trust that made that system work. "Sir, if I may," Morrison said carefully, "one person's betrayal doesn't invalidate the loyalty and integrity of everyone around you. For every Tom Parker Bowles, there are dozens of people who serve the crown faithfully every day. People like your private secretary, your household staff, and yes, your security detail." Prince William turned back from the window with a slight smile. "You're right, of course. And that's precisely why this commendation is so important. It's not just recognition for you, It's a statement about the values we expect from those who serve the crown. The conversation turned to practical matters as the prince briefed Morrison on changes to security protocols that had been implemented following the investigation. Access to sensitive areas of the palace had been further restricted, computer systems had been upgraded with enhanced security measures, and background checks for all staff and regular visitors had been strengthened. "There's one more thing," the prince said as their meeting drew to a close. "I want you to know that your actions during this crisis have given me complete confidence in the security arrangements for my family. When I think about the future, about the challenges the monarchy will face in the coming decades, I'm reassured knowing that people like you are watching over us." Morrison felt a surge of pride at those words. After 23 years of service, to receive such recognition from the future king was more meaningful than any formal honor or commendation. As Morrison prepared to leave, Prince William added, "Oh, and James, when the knighthood is announced, remember that it's not just for what you did during the Tom Parker Bowles investigation. It's for more than 2 decades of faithful service, for putting duty above personal convenience every single day." Walking back through the palace corridors after his meeting with the prince, Morrison encountered several staff members who nodded respectfully as he passed. Word had spread through the palace community about his role in uncovering the espionage plot, and he had noticed a subtle change in how people interacted with him. There was a deeper respect, an acknowledgement that he had faced an extraordinary challenge and handled it with complete professionalism. That evening, Morrison sat in his small flat near the palace, reflecting on the events of the past few months and what they meant for his future. The knighthood would be a remarkable capstone to his career, but he knew that his real reward was the knowledge that he had protected the institution he had devoted his life to serving. The case had also taught him valuable lessons about the evolving nature of threats to the royal family. Traditional security concerns about physical attacks or public demonstrations were being supplemented by new challenges involving cyber espionage, insider threats, and the exploitation of family relationships for intelligence gathering. The protection squad would need to adapt its methods and training to address these sophisticated new forms of attack. Morrison's phone buzzed with a text message from Inspector Wells. "Sir, thought you should know that Tom Parker Bowles was sentenced today. 12 years for treason, conspiracy, and theft of state secrets. Patricia Hartwell received 8 years. Justice has been served." Morrison felt a grim satisfaction at the news. The sentences were appropriate for the severity of their crimes and would serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar betrayals. But he also felt sadness for Camilla, who would have to live with the knowledge that her son was serving a lengthy prison sentence for betraying the family she had worked so hard to join. The next morning brought a return to routine palace operations, but Morrison noticed that the atmosphere felt different. The successful resolution of the espionage case had strengthened confidence in the palace's security systems and demonstrated that threats would be identified and neutralized regardless of their source. Staff members went about their duties with renewed pride in their work and confidence in their leadership. Morrison conducted his morning briefing with the same attention to detail and professional standards that had characterized his entire career. He reviewed overnight security reports, coordinated with law enforcement agencies, and ensured that every aspect of the royal family's protection was functioning smoothly. But he also found himself thinking about legacy and the future of the protection squad. The Tom Parker Bowles case had shown how traditional loyalty and modern threats could intersect in dangerous ways. Future security officers would need to be trained not just in physical protection and crowd control, but in recognizing and countering sophisticated intelligence operations. As Morrison looked out over the palace grounds where tourists gathered to watch the changing of the guard, he reflected on the continuity of tradition and the constant need to adapt to new challenges. The ceremony being performed below had remained essentially unchanged for centuries, but the security arrangements protecting it had evolved continuously to address new forms of threat. The monarchy itself was like that ceremony, rooted in tradition but constantly adapting to survive and thrive in a changing world. Morrison's role had been to ensure that adaptation could happen safely, protecting the institution from those who would exploit its openness and trust for their own purposes. Standing at his office window, Morrison felt the deep satisfaction that came from duty faithfully performed. The crown was secure, the threats had been neutralized, and the next generation of security professionals was being trained to face whatever challenges the future might bring. He had played his part in preserving something greater than himself, something worth protecting. The case of Tom Parker Bowles and Patricia Hartwell had tested Morrison's skills, judgment, and loyalty in ways he had never anticipated. But it had also confirmed his belief that some things were worth defending regardless of personal cost, and that the duty to protect the crown was more than just a job. It was a sacred trust that connected him to centuries of faithful service. As the morning sun climbed higher over London, Morrison returned to his desk to begin another day of protecting the royal family. The work was never finished, the vigilance never relaxed, but the purpose remained constant, ensuring that the monarchy would endure and thrive for future generations. It was work worth doing, work that gave meaning to his life and honor to his service.